The gavel struck, sharp and final, slicing through the murmurs that filled the courtroom. My father's attorney, Richard Cole, a silver-haired man who mistook volume for conviction, leaned forward and slammed his fist onto the table. "She's a disgrace, thrown out of the army in shame." His words echoed, each syllable a bullet aimed at whatever was left of my dignity. I stood still, my hands clasped in front of me, eyes fixed on the judge. My back was straight, shoulders squared, the posture of someone trained never to flinch, even under fire. Inside, though, I felt that familiar burn behind my ribs. The same one I'd felt when my father first said those words at the dinner table months ago. Disgrace. He'd said it like a sentence, not a description. I thought I was used to it by now, but somehow, hearing it again in front of strangers, under oath, still cut deep. I looked at Richard's smug expression, the little smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He thought this was just another performance, another way to please my father. My father, Robert Hale, sat a few feet away, arms crossed, face carved from stone. A retired litigator, obsessed with reputation, not truth. He didn't even look at me. He never did when things got ugly. He'd always say, "Keep your composure, Emily. Don't embarrass yourself." Funny how the man who taught me control never noticed that I learned it better than he ever could. The judge, an older man with calm, assessing eyes, watched us in silence. He didn't interrupt the attorney's theatrics. He just let the tension hang there, thick and heavy. I wondered if he saw what was really happening here. This wasn't just a property hearing. It was a public execution of my name, orchestrated by my own family. I kept my gaze steady, even as Richard sneered. "Your Honor," he said, feigning politeness, "my client's daughter has a history of disciplinary issues. Her own discharge report confirms it. She's not a reliable witness, nor a responsible custodian of this estate." I could almost hear the whispers ripple through the room. Discharged, unfit, dishonor, words that carried so much weight in my father's world. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't move. Years of command briefings had taught me that silence could be more powerful than argument. Still, I could feel my pulse drumming in my ears, every beat reminding me of the humiliation I had learned to endure in silence. Then something shifted. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable. He studied me for a long moment. Too long. Then, without a word, he reached up and began unbuttoning the top of his robe. A murmur swept the courtroom. Slowly, deliberately, he took it off and folded it over the bench. Underneath, on his crisp white shirt, gleamed a single insignia, silver, unmistakable. A brigadier general's pin. My breath caught. He stood, eyes never leaving mine. "Captain," he said quietly. But the weight of his tone silenced the entire room. "You will address this court with the respect your service deserves." The words landed like a detonation. Controlled, precise, devastating. My father's attorney froze mid-breath. My father's jaw slackened, the color draining from his face. For once, he didn't know what to say. The courtroom seemed to tilt, the balance of power shifting in an instant. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The years of quiet endurance, the sleepless nights, the classified silence, it all converged in that moment of stillness. The man who'd once condemned me without understanding what I gave up to. Protect him now sat small in the presence of someone who knew the truth. And as the judge's words hung in the air, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Vindication, not loud or vengeful. Quiet, cold, precise. He thought calling me a disgrace would win him the case. He had no idea the judge once read my mission briefs under blackout conditions in Kabul. To understand how it came to this, you need to know the two worlds I lived in. My father, Robert Hale, a retired corporate litigator obsessed with reputation, believed that success wasn't something you earned. It was something I performed. My mother, Elaine, always polished that performance. She'd smooth over every sharp word with a sigh and say, "You know how your father is." That was her way of keeping the peace. But peace in our home was built on silence. Mine. My brother, Mark, the golden child, could do no wrong. He worked in finance, wore tailored suits, and spoke the language my parents worshipped: quarterly growth, stock performance, promotions. I, on the other hand, spoke a language they didn't understand: orders, strategy, honor. To them, that made me reckless. Dinner at our house always felt like an unspoken competition. My father would sit at the head of the table, spinning stories about Mark's latest accomplishments, each one inflated with pride. "Did you hear?" he'd say, looking around the table as if he were addressing a courtroom. "Mark's been promoted to VP at 34. Not many can pull that off." My mother would nod, eyes gleaming. "He's always been such a go-getter," she'd say, ladling mashed potatoes onto his plate like a medal ceremony in miniature. I'd wait for my turn. Quiet, patient, foolishly hopeful. "That's great," I'd offer. "We actually wrapped up Operation Night Circuit last month." My father's fork would pause mid-air, and the room would still. "Operation what now?" he'd ask, half laughing. "Oh, right, one of those E-classified adventures again." "Spare us the hero talk, Emily. We're talking about real jobs." The words hit like shrapnel. Small but piercing. I'd swallow, smile, and go silent. That was my role. The daughter with the hobby job. The disappointment they could still brag about for appearances. Later that night, while they slept in comfort, I was thousands of miles away, in a dim forward operating base outside Aleppo. The room hummed with low voices and the static of encrypted channels. "Alpha line compromised," I said into my headset, eyes locked on the flickering satellite feed. Signal relayed via S-band. Engaging Ghost Protocol fallback. My team moved with precision. A wrong command could cost lives. One decision could alter an entire mission. And in that moment, I wasn't the invisible daughter. I was Captain Emily Hale, mission lead, communications authority, responsible for every man and woman in that room. When the breach alert finally turned green, signaling success, a quiet murmur of relief spread across the station. My commanding officer gave me a curt nod, approval that meant more than any of my father's half-hearted praises. I didn't smile. I couldn't afford to. I'd learned that leadership wasn't about recognition. It was about responsibility, but part of me still wished someone back home could see that. I sometimes imagined a split screen of my life. On one side, Mark standing before his coworkers, fumbling through a PowerPoint presentation about third-quarter growth while half the room scrolled through their phones. On the other, me, headset on, eyes sharp, voice steady, as I relayed tactical intercept orders that prevented a coordinated strike. My brother's world rewarded confidence, no matter how shallow. Mine punished hesitation, no matter how small. Yet in my family's eyes, his glass office shone brighter than any mission I'd ever led. When the rumors about my discharge spread, they didn't ask. They didn't want the truth. My father showed up uninvited, holding a folded newspaper clipping like evidence in a case. "Administrative separation," he read aloud. "That's just a fancy way of saying you were kicked out, isn't it?" My mother stood behind him, her face carefully neutral. I tried to explain, to tell them that it wasn't disgrace, it was strategy. A cover story. I'd taken responsibility to protect a local informant, whose identity, if exposed, would have cost lives. But to them, all that mattered was the word printed in black ink. I remember his voice, calm but cutting. "You embarrassed this family." No one mentioned the classified commendation I'd received 3 months later. No one asked why my name appeared, coded, in a defense intelligence memo. All they saw was what they wanted to see: failure. It's strange, the things people choose to remember. They remembered my brother's wedding toast, but not the year I sent half my salary home when Dad's firm went under. They remembered my discharge, but not the lives I saved. To them, my uniform wasn't a badge of honor. It was a costume I refused to take off. Sometimes I'd replay it all in my head. The dinners, the dismissals, the way my father's eyes lit up when Mark walked in but dimmed when I did. Each slight stacked neatly on top of the last, like a quiet tower of proof. Proof that no matter what I did, I'd always be the lesser one, the invisible child. But the Army taught me something they never could. That honor doesn't need an audience, and procedure, when used correctly, speaks louder than pride. For years, I tried to explain honor to people who only understood image. But the truth was, the Army taught me something they never could. When words fail, procedure speaks. When my father tried to take my mother's house, he didn't even pretend it was about justice. He framed it as responsibility, a word he wielded like a weapon. His argument was simple: my discharge made me unfit to manage her estate. "It's not personal," he said over the phone, his tone clipped, professional. But it was. Every word dripped with the same contempt he'd carried for years, the quiet satisfaction of proving me wrong. That night, I sat alone at my desk, the legal notice trembling slightly in my hand. For a moment, I almost let the old exhaustion win. Almost. Then I exhaled, set the paper down, and pulled my laptop closer. If he wanted to fight, he'd get one, but not the kind he expected. I wasn't going to yell, or beg, or defend my worth to him again. I'd learned long ago that emotion only fueled his arrogance. Procedure, though. Procedure terrified men like him. So I filed my motion pro se, representing myself. Every keystroke felt deliberate, surgical. I cited sections of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, referenced property, statutes, and built my argument with the precision of a tactical operation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. I'd spent years navigating systems where a single misplaced word could cost lives. Compared to that, his legal theatrics felt almost juvenile. When I attached my exhibits, I made sure to include one document he'd never seen, a letter from the Department of Defense Recognition Board acknowledging the classified commendation tied to my service. It wasn't emotional ammunition. It was procedural proof. Still, I needed one more layer of insurance. I reached out to an old ally, Major Lena Ortiz, a JAG officer who'd once sat across from me during endless midnight briefings. D.O.D. Clause 72. Bravo, I told her quietly. She understood immediately. Within days, she had authenticated my service record under the declassification clause. The evidence would now be admissible in open court. I didn't need to expose the mission, just the truth that my so-called disgrace had been an act of protection. The last piece was the judge. I'd researched the docket and ensured my case fell under a specific jurisdiction, one presided over by a retired general-turned-circuit court judge, the same man who, years ago, had read my mission reports under blackout conditions. It wasn't manipulation. It was alignment. The right man, in the right courtroom, with the right understanding of what honor actually meant. When I finally hit submit, the confirmation page glowed on my screen. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of my apartment pressing against me. There was no triumph, no relief, just a focused calm. I thought of all the times my father had dismissed me, all the dinners where he'd turned my achievements into punchlines, all the years he'd mistaken restraint for weakness. This wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about reminding myself who I really was when no one believed it. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an email notification, a case update. The hearing date was confirmed. I opened the PDF, scanning the list of counsel. There it was, his attorney's name in bold, followed by mine. Next to it, a single word that made me smile, self-represented. Later that day, I overheard that his attorney had laughed when he saw it. "She's representing herself?" He'd scoffed. "This should be quick." I almost felt sorry for him, almost, because he had no idea. I'd spent years debriefing colonels under crossfire. This would just be another kind of battlefield. The courtroom was packed. Oak walls, murmuring voices, cameras flashing, just enough to make it feel less like a hearing, and more like a show. My father, Robert Hale, sat at the plaintiff's table, suit perfectly pressed, posture rehearsed. Beside him was his attorney, Richard Cole, the same man who once accused me of being a disgrace. They were flanked by family friends and a few local reporters he'd invited to witness justice. That was the word he used. Justice. As if this whole performance was about truth and not about pride. I sat across from them, alone. Calm. Focused. My notes were neatly stacked in front of me, pen aligned parallel to the paper. Years in uniform had taught me how to prepare for battle, no matter the terrain. When the hearing began, Richard stood with the smug confidence of a man convinced he was already winning. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and theatrical. "My client simply seeks to protect his late wife's estate from an unfit custodian. Captain Hale, former Captain Hale, was discharged from service for misconduct. She has a history of emotional instability and cannot be trusted with assets of significant value." Every word was calculated, delivered slowly, so it would land with maximum sting. I didn't flinch. I took notes. Every insult, every mischaracterization. I logged it calmly, as if I were back in a debriefing. Across the aisle, my father sat stone-faced, nodding slightly at each accusation. I'd seen that look before. Approval without acknowledgement. The same expression he wore at my brother's graduation. The same one he never wore for mine. Richard went on, gesturing dramatically toward me. "Your Honor, her service record speaks for itself. A dishonorable stain." The sound of the gavel cracked through the air like gunfire. Everyone froze. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Counselor," he said, voice calm but edged with authority, "where did you obtain that record?" Richard blinked. "It's public record, sir." The judge's expression hardened. "Public?" "Not unless you hold level 5 clearance." A whisper rolled through the room. The attorney stammered. My father frowned, confused. And then, in one deliberate motion, the judge began to remove his robe. The room fell silent. When he straightened, the insignia on his shirt caught the light, a silver star, polished and unmistakable. He looked directly at me. "Captain Hale," he said evenly, "it's been a long time since Kabul." For a second, I couldn't breathe. I hadn't expected him, General Donovan, the man who had once signed off on my mission, orders, the one who'd seen my team through the chaos of Operation Night Circuit. The room collectively inhaled. I heard my father whisper, "Captain," as if saying it might somehow make it less real. The judge nodded toward the clerk. "Read it," he instructed. The clerk opened a sealed envelope and began to read aloud. "For exceptional conduct during Operation Night Circuit, Captain Emily Hale prevented loss of life by assuming personal responsibility for a classified breach. The record of administrative discharge is hereby corrected to reflect honorable service." Every word struck like a hammer, steady, undeniable, absolute. The courtroom was so still you could hear the flick of paper as the clerk turned the page. My father's attorney looked like he might faint. My father's lips parted, color draining from his face. You were that Hale?" he whispered, almost to himself. I stood then, calm, composed, hands at my sides, posture perfect. "Sir," I said quietly, "I still am." There was no gloating in my voice, no triumph, just truth, the kind that didn't need embellishment. The judge gave a small nod, an acknowledgement that carried more weight than any applause. "This court recognizes the corrected record," he said. All claims of unfitness are dismissed. My father's attorney stumbled over an apology. My father said nothing. He just sat there, hands trembling slightly, his once commanding voice gone. For the first time in my life, he couldn't speak over me. As I gathered my papers, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't victory. It was release. For years, I'd lived under his definition of worth. That day, I walked out under my own. My father spent my entire life teaching me to respect rank. That day, he finally learned who outranked who. The hallway outside the courtroom felt different than when I'd walked in. Quieter. Heavier. As if even the air understood something irreversible had just shifted. Reporters lined the corridor, microphones extended, questions flying in every direction, but I moved past them without a word. My father slipped out a side exit before anyone could stop him, head down, avoiding every camera, every eye. For a man who once thrived on attention, silence had finally found him. The judge caught up to me near the door. His voice was steady, low. "The Army remembers its own, Captain." He shook my hand once firmly, then left me standing there in the middle of it all. Still, calm, finally free. A month later, I got a letter, thick envelope, government seal, addressed in precise block lettering. Inside was a single sheet from the Department of Defense. Formal reinstatement of honorable discharge. Retroactive commendation for exceptional conduct. I read it twice before I set it down. The paper didn't feel like vindication. It felt like confirmation. Proof that the truth had always existed, even when no one cared to see it. I placed it in a folder, not for pride, but for record-keeping. Procedure, as always. 1 year later, I found myself in a different kind of uniform. Civilian clothes, badge clipped to my belt, my name on a small brass plate outside an office, Lieutenant Colonel E. Hale, Ret. Cyber Operations Consultant. My days were spent training younger analysts, sharp minds who reminded me of myself before all. The noise, before the exhaustion of being doubted by the people who should have known better. They didn't see me as a soldier or a scandal, just a professional who knew her craft. For the first time, I wasn't fighting for recognition. I was simply doing the work. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking out over the intelligence floor, the hum of computers, the quiet conversations between agents and analysts. It was strange, how peace could feel so still after years of being on edge. There was no parade, no applause, just a sense of equilibrium I'd never had before. My worth no longer needed witnesses. Then one evening, my phone buzzed, a text from an unfamiliar number. Until I read the name. My father. Just 2 sentences. "Your mother would have been proud. Dinner sometime?" I stared at the words for a long time. Once, that kind of message would have torn something open in me. Hope, anger, confusion. But now, I just felt distance. Clean, calm distance. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I archived it, kept it where it belonged. Not erased, but categorized, documented. That night, as I left the building, the city lights stretched across the horizon like veins of gold. My reflection in the glass looked different now. Older, steadier, whole. I thought about the girl who once sat in silence at dinner tables, who let her father's opinions define her, who mistook his approval for validation. She was gone. What remained was someone who had built her own kind of legacy, one not inherited, but earned. I used to think legacy was something passed down, but I learned it's something you build line by line under oath, even when no one's watching. The medals, the papers, the commendations, they weren't the victory. The victory was that I no longer needed to prove I deserved them. They called me a disgrace, but I didn't need their respect, just the truth. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have believed in you first, tell your story below. In this community, rank is earned, not given.